So, J. Ruud, what lovable book are we talking about today?
Well, I'll give you a hint, Stacey Market Jones. On the Rainy River.
I don't know, Lucky Charms. I'll need another hint. Welcome back to Between the Covers, and I need at least one more hint to try to guess tonight's book.
Okay, well, here's hint number 2. How to tell a true war story.
Okay, I think I know it, but I can't remember the title. Give me one more hint.
Last hint is Vietnam.
Or
Vietnam. Yes.
Is it The Things They Carried?
It is The Things They Carried. You are absolutely right.
Look at me.
Wow, by Tim O'Brien.
All right.
Now, you probably are thinking, hey, J. Ruud, this is not a novel. This is a collection of short stories. You're cheating. I call a foul.
You have no idea what I'm thinking because I'm not thinking any of those things. I thought you knew me. I'm thinking that these are linked short stories about a central topic, which is Vietnam and the Vietnam War. Am I correct?
You are correct in that. But the other answer to it is, it's my list and I can do whatever I want. If I want to use short stories, I will. I
like how you put words in my mouth just so that you could be like stomp your foot and say, it's my list and I'm going to do what I want. But I'm happy to help you out in any way possible. So
that.
Who else, before we talk about the book specifically, who else thinks that this book is lovable? What other lists was this on, if any?
It was a finalist for the 1990 Pulitzer Prize. It was also on the finalist for the 1990 National Book Critics Circle Award for fiction. It didn't win either one. But in 2014, Amazon came out with a list of 100 books to read in a lifetime. And it was on that list.
Okay.
And in 2016, the Library of Congress created an American Reads program, which honored 65 books chosen by the public as the most influential books written and read in America and their impact on our lives. And it was in that 65 books that were part of that display. Goodreads Listopia has a list of more than 1,600 greatest war novels of all time. And The Things We Carried came in as number 3 on that list of 1,600 books.
It surprises me it didn't come out until 1990 because I think of it as having more recency with the Vietnam War. That's interesting to me. We can get into that.
O'Brien had, he was writing from his experiences. He was in Vietnam in 1969, 1970. He published a book, a novel called Going After Chicado or Cacheado, in 1978, which won the National Book Award, actually. But this book is just, there's been more of a reaction to this book, and it's more often taught in schools and probably banned often.
Probably.
One other list, there's a site called Shortform, and the creators of the site say that it is their purpose to make sense of information. And they do all kinds of strange things. One is there's a list of the 100 best books of war fiction ever. And on that list, The Things They Carried comes in at number 1.
I can see why. So your down and dirty summary for this is going to be interesting because it's short stories.
Yeah.
So why don't you just give us the overview or the thematic? Obviously, we talked a little bit about it, but if you can give us, the elevator speech for the book overall, and then we can get a little bit more into it.
Well, as I said, it stems from O'Brien's experiences in Vietnam in 69 and 70. And it tells stories about the war and its aftermath among the members of Alpha Company. There are individual soldiers that are introduced in the first story, which is called The Things They Carried. And as in the rest of the book, one of those characters appears as sort of the protagonist of that story.
Oh, okay.
So it's all connected in that way. And it reads very much like a memoir.
Oh.
Especially since the narrator is named Tim O'Brien. And he dedicates the book to the members of Alpha Company.
Okay.
But
it's fiction.
It's fiction.
Okay.
everybody, none of these people who are listed as members of Alpha Company are actual people.
Okay.
I mean, they're based on people that he knew or a combination of people that he knew. But it deals with the war itself. Mm-hmm. It deals with what happens to some of them after the war. Mm-hmm. And it even deals with something that happens before the war.
Right.
When Tim O'Brien, in
Fictional
quotation
Tim.
marks, is given his draft notice.
Sure. I think I've read that story. Is there a lake? Is there a canoe and a lake involved? Or is that a different
There's
story?
a canoe and a river involved.
Okay.
That's
Then I have read that
on
story.
the Rainy River, which
Yes,
was
I
my
have
first clue.
Yes.
You may recall.
I have read that story. Yeah, I think that's interesting because it is something that I think it's a tactic you can use as a writer when you want to tell a story of your life, but you don't want to tell other people's stories for them, right? So in a memoir, obviously you interact with other people and you have to do that very carefully, I think. We were just watching the Sopranos documentary and Marchand says that to David Chase, I'm assuming this creature I am portraying is deceased because she was portraying kind of his mother, right?
Yeah.
And she was like, I don't want to be doing this to somebody who's alive.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something to consider when you're considering memoir. It's how is it going to impact the people I write about? And this is a way around that, is to fictionalize some of the specifics, but the stories are still true, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's truth in the stories.
Yeah. Yes. And that gets into the idea of how do you tell a true war story, which is one of the stories in the book.
Which is a meta.
Yeah. And it's very much about how do you tell a true war story. In that story, one of the members of Alpha Company, named Kurt Lemon, has actually died. And his best friend, Rat Kiley, writes a letter to Lemon's sister to tell her about what happened and how he was killed. Now, how he was killed was the two of them were playing catch with a grenade. Lemon jumped, he was in the shade of a tree. He jumped kind of into the light to catch the grenade and stepped on a mine and it blew him up. But Lemon doesn't tell that to his sister. He tells her, what a hero he was and all this kind of thing. And she never writes back to him. And that just gets under his skin because he wanted so much to tell her about what happened to her brother and wanted her to appreciate it, and she never wrote back. And he starts shooting this water buffalo.
Yeah, that's the part I remember from that story because it is so upsetting. And I was in a class, I read it in a writing class, and somebody in the class said, you're more upset about the water buffalo than the people. But I think it's because it's just so needless.
Yeah, but
I mean, it's all needless the way it's portrayed in the story, but it's just so cruelty for cruelty's sake. And
he just keeps shooting the bug. He just keeps
awful.
shooting it.
I remember my stomach
long after it's dead.
It's terrible.
But it's how he's sort of taking out all of this stress that's been on him. As that story goes on, O'Brien makes a lot of statements about what a true war story is and what it's not. I'm going to read you what sounds like a long paragraph, but it's actually several sentences from different parts of the story where he just will say, well, a true story is this way. And then another paragraph he'll say, but a true story is also this way.
Yeah. Before you do that, let's talk a little bit about how it is a meta narrative, right? Because it's about, I mean, the story is called How to Write a True War Story.
Yeah.
And he's addressing the reader in a way, right? These are the choices I'm making as a writer trying to convey the truth of war and the challenge of that.
Yeah.
So there's, in theater, the fourth wall, he's really breaking that fourth wall because he's
telling the reader, along, here's how you tell a true war story.
Here's how. So you come out of the narrative to consider, okay, how is he telling this? But of course, those seem casual and impromptu and in a way, but they're not. Of course, they're carefully crafted as well.
Yeah.
And that's something to consider, I think, as a writer too, when you read the story, is where he made those decisions. And so, so go ahead. Because I just wanted to be clear about what that kind of narrative is like to read.
Yeah. He says a true war story is never moral. It does not instruct nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing things that men have always done. In any war story, but especially a true one, it's difficult to separate what happened from what seemed to happen. Mm-hmm. You can tell a true war story by the way it never seems to end. Not then, not ever. True war stories do not generalize. They do not indulge in abstraction or analysis. Often in a true war story, there's not even a point, or else the point doesn't hit you until 20 years later in your sleep. And you wake up and shake your wife and start telling the story to her, except when you get to the end and you've forgotten the point again. And in the end, of course, a true war story is never about the war. It's about sunlight. Because of the sunlight that Lemon stepped into. It's about the special way that dawn spreads out on a river when you know you must cross the river and march into the mountains and do things you are afraid to do. It's about love and memory. It's about sorrow. It's about sisters who never write back and people who never listen. So a lot of the book is about truth and how you sometimes have to tell a fiction to tell a truth.
Right.
Which is why the book is fictional.
And how to convey the story or how to convey the truth of it with the narrative techniques that are available to us. Or, writing on a page. How do you make that how do you convey what it's like to be in a war with words on a page?
Yeah.
I'm assuming that this is particularly effective. Obviously, it's on all these lists. It's on your list. Why do you think this meta-narrative works so well with this instead of just, telling some terrible story so people can see how terrible it is to be in war?
Yeah. Well, it does that.
Right. It does that, but it doesn't stop there.
It's also about people's reactions to it and how they think about it and how it affects them later on. And those are all things that get mixed up in the telling of the story. You said something about it's not a memoir. You can't tell another person's story. But you have to be mindful. Let's just say that. Yeah. Well, one of the stories in the book is called Speaking of Courage. So, truth is one of the themes of the book. Courage is another theme of the book. Right. And in fact, in the very first story, the things they carried, one of the things that it says there is that that the men killed other men because they were embarrassed not to. And that's the main reason. And so that gets mixed up with this story of Speaking of Courage. And it's about a guy named Norman Bowker, who's from Iowa, and he's returned to Iowa after the war to his hometown. And his best friend has killed himself, drowned himself in a lake. His girlfriend has married somebody else. So he's spending the 4th of July just driving around this lake and thinking about the past and thinking about what happened. And the narrator says that he had been braver than he ever thought possible, but he had not been so brave as he wanted to be. And it goes into the death of this guy named Kiowa, who's kind of everybody's favorite in the whole company. And his death comes back in several of the stories. But Kai was killed one night during a rainstorm after the company has pitched their tents in this open field and then realized that this field is basically the sewage dump for the village that they're next to. Yeah. And when the rain comes, it turns into this kind of muck, and Kiowa is stuck in the muck and he's sinking, and Bowker has tried to save him. Bowker brings back 7 medals from Vietnam, and his father's terribly proud of him. He's got a Purple Heart, he's got a Bronze Star, but he feels like he could have won the Silver Star if he had saved Kiowa. So what bothers him is that he didn't get that Silver Star because he didn't save Kiowa, because he tried to save him, but he kept sinking, and he could only save himself, and he had to let go of him, and he sinks into what O'Brien calls a shit field, which is not it's a kind of an obvious metaphor for Vietnam itself.
Right. For the war.
Yeah.
Not
for the war. O'Brien says there's a kind of postscript after the story, and O'Brien says that Bowker asked him to write this story. So he's actually asked him to write his story.
Is the postscript real or fictional?
We're not telling, because he never tells. It's probably fictional because Bowker is fictional. But he says, but there may have been some truth to it. There may have been somebody
said, could you take this on?
And he writes the story, and 3 years later, Bowker hangs himself.
Yeah. And
O'Brien wonders if he told the story right.
Yeah. This reminds me, I just finished a podcast called In the Dark, the season 3, which is about the Haditha, the alleged war crimes in Haditha in Iraq by U.S. soldiers.
Yeah.
And you listened to one of those episodes with me. And this just takes me to that, which is, recent, right? It's like we're just doing, I guess war is, however much the technology of war advances, it's still war.
War is a shit field.
Well, yeah. And they likened that to My Lai.
Yeah.
So it also shows how this came out in 1990 based about the Vietnam War, but it's cogent, it's still relevant, and it still may help us understand, and it's probably a necessary read. It isn't only about Vietnam.
No, it's about war, and it's about truth, and it's about courage. Speaking of courage, which is the title of that story, but also the Rainy River story is about courage. It's a fascinating story. Full truth, I have written an article about it. I published an article about it.
You can Google that.
But it's a story that anybody who was alive, any person of draft age who was alive in 1969 will identify with this narrator and what he's going through.
Because he's trying to decide if he stays and gets drafted or if he leaves the country.
Right.
Forever, basically.
Yeah, he's deciding whether to go to Canada. And he's in Minnesota. He lives in Worthington, Minnesota. He drives to the Rainy River, which is a border between Minnesota and Canada. And on one side of the river, he's in Minnesota. And the other side of the river, he's in Canada and can't be drafted. He's at this resort for a few days, and he's the only guy there because it's way out of season. And the guy who runs the resort kind of knows what he can tell what he's doing. He can tell why he's there. And he goes fishing, and the guy from the resort takes the boat, rows to the other side of the river, where if the narrator wants to, he can jump out of that boat and be in Canada. Just swim a few yards and he'll be in Canada. And he's hesitating, deciding what to do. He says, well, for one thing, he says, you don't make a war without knowing why. This is why he's deciding whether he should actually be drafted or not. Knowledge, of course, is always imperfect, but it seemed to me that when a nation goes to war, it must have reasonable confidence of the justice and imperative of its cause. You can't fix your mistakes. Once people are dead, you can't make them undead. And that's what's driving him to go to Canada and not take part in this shit field. But he's in the boat, and he thinks to himself, I did not want people to think badly of me. Not my parents, not my brother and sister, not even the folks down at the Gobbler Cafe. I was ashamed to be there at the Tip Top Lodge. I was ashamed of my conscience, ashamed to be doing the right thing, which is related to that comment that men kill the other men because they're embarrassed not to.
Right.
And at the end of the story, the narrator, in this ironic twist that completely reverses common expectations, says he returned home, was drafted, went to Vietnam, and returned. And he says, I survived, but it's not a happy ending.
Yeah.
I was a coward. I went to the war.
Well, Yeah, I mean, I guess he calls himself a coward, but it also is indicative of things beyond war, which is that a lot of times your choices are two bad ones. A lot of times in life, you're faced with a decision and the options are both bad. I mean, they both have implications. And to put young men in this situation is, of course, I just read the LBJ biography, which is a lot about Vietnam.
Yeah.
So that's really...
Hey, LBJ, How many kids did you kill today?
So why, before we go on to the ranking, I want to ask you why you personally love this book.
Well, as you may know, I was 19 in 1969. Now, the narrator of the story has just finished college, so he no longer has a student deferment.
Right.
What happened in 1969 was that all student deferments were canceled, which in part was not a terrible decision, because with student deferments, that meant that in general, the richer kids got out of being drafted, at least as long as they were still in college.
Right.
But they replaced the old system with a lottery. The lottery was done by your birthday.
Oh.
So, if you were born on September 8th, and that was picked as, I think that was picked as the number 8, you were going to Vietnam.
Okay. So it wasn't in order of your birthday. They picked dates randomly. And then that was your number.
So,
okay.
My birthday happened to be number 348, which meant I was not going.
For a long time.
Well, they would have to, have invaded the U.S. and there was no way. The first 75 to 100 were fairly sure of going. And, I knew guys who had to go. I also knew guys that, got a low number and were able to join the National Guard, which meant they didn't have to go. They could stay and do their service in the country, unlike recent wars where the National Guard has been sent overseas.
Right.
Then I knew people who had gone and come back and were
changed,
very much changed, either incredibly vocal against the war or drug addicts. I mean, it was so I was very much personally kind of feeling for the people in the stories.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. Thinking about this book, I mean, obviously there's a lot. I think there's a lot to love about it, even if you weren't 19 in 1969. But there may be people who don't love this book who might not like the things they carried by Tim O'Brien.
I would say, actually, most veterans of the war like this book.
They do?
Yeah, because it does seem very true, most of what he says.
Okay.
But, there are people who will call it anti-patriotic or anti-military and that sort of thing.
Sure.
So they might not like it.
They're questioning.
Yeah, they don't like the questioning.
You might not like it if you don't like to read short stories.
Well, that's
even
true.
Though they're linked.
You might not like it if you don't like war stories.
Yeah, right. And it's excruciatingly violent. The water buffalo.
The water buffalo, yeah.
Sometimes it's excruciating.
It is. Well, yeah. I mean, when Lemon gets blown up, the narrator talks about how he was up in the tree.
Yeah, don't.
Throwing the parts of his body down.
Yeah.
Well, one of the other guys was singing Lemon Tree. Very pretty. So there are those kinds of things.
Yeah, because he's trying to tell a true war story,
yeah,
not a propaganda war story.
Yeah.
So, okay. So where on we have 10 books so far.
10. So, well, this will be number 11.
This will be the 11th. So where are you ranking this? And we'll have your list on your jruud.com. So.
Yeah. I think I'm going to put this finished as number 9. So
okay.
Ahead of Moby Dick and
I hope so.
Jeez, Louise. Ahead of Moby Dick and Babbitt.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I guess it's probably now time for Chaos Reader.
It is. Well, as I said, I finally finished LBJ, and I am still reading the biography of Catherine, Princess of Wales. But we did finish reading Laura Ingalls Wilder, These Happy Golden Years, aloud. And this is kind of the last of the quintessential Little House on the Prairie books. There is another book after this called The First 4 Years, which is about her first 4 years of married life. This is kind of the romance novel of the collection because it really covers the relationship between Almanzo Wilder and Laura Ingalls and how they get to know each other.
So it's the book in which she becomes Laura Ingalls Wilder?
Yes, because she does marry him, spoiler. But so this happens in DeSmet, and she gets a teaching certificate, and it's very, there's that kind of suspense around it. Of course, it's not that suspenseful since we know her last name. But again, these
you know
are
it from the title page.
People think of these as memoirs. They are not. They are fictional works based on her life. So we don't really know.
Unlike the things they carried.
Yeah, exactly. So, and, I've heard these described as false nostalgia because maybe their lives in DeSmet weren't ever even really like this. Maybe they were harder than this or what, it's like she's hearkening back to this childhood when they were on the frontier and there were not many people around. Would they ride around on the horse for 2 hours and saw 6 houses? And he was like, boy, the country's really filling up.
Yeah, we got to move on.
But I did really like reading this again as a 55-year-old instead of I think the last time I read it, I was probably 19. So it was interesting.
So which book does Mary get married in?
Mary never married. Albert didn't exist. Anyway, I was a tour guide and I got a lot of questions about the TV show. So if you like the TV show, but you want to know a little more about the facts of the life, but I would recommend, honestly, Prairie Fire, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning biography of her. That was really good. That tells you what actually happened versus how she portrays their lives in the fictional series. So before we break today, we'd like to remind everybody that we are giving away copies of our books to
Treasure
people
Sherwood,
who
Mr. Catherine,
to people who review our podcast and comment on the Apple Podcast app. So if you leave a review with a comment about why you like the podcast and include your most lovable book, then when the contest period concludes, we will draw a name and give free books away. So please go ahead and go like, share, comment, tell your friends. And we'd like to also ask our listeners to just tell one person that you think would like our podcast about the podcast. You must know another book lover. So you can share that. That'd be great.
So that's episode 13 that we're going to make the drawing in.
Yes. It's coming up.
Is being my answer.
Yes. All right.
Okay.
Well, we'd like to thank our producer, creative director, tech person, everything, director of photography, everything,
Jack
Jerry
of all
Bruno.
trades. You're welcome.
We couldn't exist without him. And we'll see you next time.
Between
the covers.